that. All right, so the first question that we've got for you guys is good behavior determined by context? So humans consider their own good behavior in terms of, or at least from a number of different sources. So if they consider good behavior at all, that is. These could be based on external motivators like societal, historical, or cultural contexts, or possibly the internal motivators that influence our perceptions, or the drivers that make up our own self-ideations or morals. And basically, good behavior could be viewed sociologically or psychologically. So we can just run through a few examples of what these different perspectives could be. A first one, which is quite common, as everybody will know, but more in the light of bad behaviors, is peer pressure. So peer groups have been long known to influence the behavior of individuals, especially at certain relevant social milestones in a human's life. Good behavior is ultimately informed by what others consider to be good, and you feel the need to respond to that. So in this sense, the behaviors can be influenced by social or the peer expectations. So such as being pressured into performing well in school, to match up with a friend's high performance, to get into the same university, or even living up to the standards of a colleague or a partner, to either outperform them or to find common ground. You find a baseline then to base your good behaviors on. Another example of perception enforcing good behavior stems from the rules of authority, which is what was mentioned just now as well. I think also with regards to that peer pressure, so how you look outward, that reputational aspect that you have associated with yourself is then managed by other people. So a great example of this is the Panopticon, which was designed by Jeremy Bentham, and it relies on the gaze of authority to maintain a higher level of good behavior, in this case obviously in prisoners. So the watchtower is constructed in the center of the prison, and the guards can see into all the cells, but the prisoners can't see the guards. So the prisoners behave according to the rules laid out by the authorities watching them, because they're never quite sure when or how they're being watched. And that then enforces the good behaviors that they perform. So in this way, the context within which a human resides then enforces how they behave, whether they innately want to or not. So defining good behavior it can be defined through normalization of actions and the choices that you make. So humans are taught basically the right things to do by their parents or neighbors or often teachers or even friend groups, which are ultimately their cultural counterparts. So it makes sense, therefore, that culture informs good behavior, because humans are ultimately social beings. They like to be part of a group and will therefore live up to the expectations of that group. This then leads over to another perspective, which looks at the psychological drivers of good behavior, whether they're either learned or discovered. So psychological influences of good behavior are linked very often to learned behaviors, but within a cultural setting. And they often go one step further to help us gain a view or a greater perspective about how the individual feels about the behaviors they're performing, whether they're good or not. Because while humans do have the capacity to do things they don't strictly want to do, there should be some inner driving force that helps them maintain those good behaviors, even if they don't, strictly speaking, want to do them. Now, everyone's familiar with Freud, and he's got a few good examples of how this is the psychological drivers of good behavior. So Freud stipulates that in generally sophisticated society, the needs and desires of an individual will often contradict what society expects. And thus the individual has to suppress their taboo ideas and their personal desires. And it is this suppression that is good behavior. The fact that you are living up to what you are expected to live up to, despite the fact that it's going against your innate natural desires, because desires of humanity are according to Freud, often quite messy and a little bit otherwise, whereas society is sophisticated and teaches you how you should be good, erring away from the things that are bad. Now, another good example of this comes from a case study that I came across in university. So a group of psychologists were interested in studying the practice of consanguinity, which is the incestuous marriage of cousins. So they studied two neighboring villages, one of which shared most Western societies' perspectives on incest, which is that it's relatively abhorrent, whereas the other village was common practice to engage in incestual marriage. If you were to take an individual from each of these villages and you were to put them in the opposite context, what they understand about what good behavior is would be completely different, strictly directly related to that concept. And in this way, we can look at Charles Darwin, who is in the picture that you guys can see now. So he was actually married to his first cousin. I don't know if anybody knows this, but they ended up having 10 children together. And they lost 3 of these children in their lifetime, as often people did in those days. But the more that Darwin started to do his research on evolution, he began to question whether the deaths of his children were due to the fact that he had married incestually. And he began to question what he thought was originally normal or good behavior and start to view it from a bad perspective. The choices that Darwin made were initially, like I said, common practice, but he then had to shift his own perspective of what was good behavior based on what he learned subsequent to what he'd been taught. So does good behavior depend entirely on the context of a situation, or is it that there is a universal truth of good? Humanity, from this perspective, they choose to make their decisions that reflect good behavior and that are often informed by a globally or a universally accepted truth, that these are the right things to do and these are the wrong things to do. So the informers of universal, what we understand about universal truths are often based in religion, but they can also be from schools of thought or just general like social philosophies. What I find is actually very interesting to look at each of these different schools and see the somewhat common ties between each of them, but also the very sort of disparate ideas around the basis of what not necessarily just drives behavior, but also enforces that good behavior. You know, these universal truths will often cross the cultural boundaries, and like Buddhism is a great example from a starting point, that the common practice means ensuring the livelihood and existence of all living creatures. That's what they base being good on. And we do take I think everybody takes a certain portion of that and carries it forward. So what they believe is that we all live alongside one another and therefore all living beings should be treated equally. So another perspective comes from Jeremy Bentham, who, as I stated earlier, he created the Panopticon. He states in the very simplest way that good behavior is merely the set of actions that benefit the majority of everybody involved in whatever that choice needs to be. Stoicism, which is an old Greek philosophy, takes that whole idea one step further and says that you need to make sure that what you do on a daily basis lives up to the virtues of wisdom and courage and justice and moderation. And that even if you don't wish to take certain actions, if they are the right thing to do, then you must do them. Now, these philosophies are more on the sort of good side of it, but you can also look at the counter of that. Nietzsche is a very popular example. So his concepts of good behavior are embedded in the idea of power, really, that if you wish to do good, you must make sure that that good will enforce some concept of power or provide you with power or has the opposite of anything that is considered to be weak. So weakness is then ultimately considered to be bad. And the last example is the polar to Stoicism, which is obviously hedonism. I think it was popularized in the 60s. I could be wrong about that. But it's a school of thought that's based on the personal pursuit of pleasure. So whatever it is that you desire, whatever it is that you need to do to ensure your own personal happiness, that is good behavior. So the